Hello and welcome to this video. Now this will be a video about a PDF invoice generator. It's a Blazor server-side application. We have a glorious interface where we see a list of existing interfaces for a user, right? And we have the ability to create a new invoice. That goes into the database, it gets stored, and then it can later be retrieved and edited. So I'll show you rather how it's all implemented, how beautiful it all is. But most importantly, I'm showing you this to show you how you can skip a few things in order to get that software released, in order to get that project of yours actually released and published. And in the next videos, I'll show you a bit of an improvement, and I'll also show you how it gets published into the iOS manager, how everything gets self-assigned, and more importantly, how it can get monetized with ad implementation, which can be a bit difficult in Blazor, but nothing to worry about. I'll explain a few options that you can choose from, and we'll go from there to publishing, and you'll actually see this application published. You will be able to interact with it, so you won't just be able to get the code, you will also be able to see the live application. So I will show you the interface where we interact with databases, and also I will show you the generator. We are using PDF Sharp. You can take a look at my video on how to use it first. That will be quite useful. And we will do a generator. It will generate a PDF file, and that PDF file will be exported. So without wasting any more time, let's get into this. What you're looking at now is the result of the whole code. Now we have right here, we have two sections, and you will see how I sort of fast forwarded the development of this nice little purple bar right here, navigation bar, whatever you want to call it, which is actually tabs in Blazor. You'll see how that works and how it actually doesn't really work all that well, but it's going to be good enough because, again, it's an early beta. I don't want to spend hours upon hours creating this navigation bar. It's a waste of time. So we have my invoices, which is basically the list of the user's invoices, and then we have the new invoice page. Now I have already created some basically nonsense values invoices, and first of all we have the draft. You will see how all the statuses come together. In this case, for now at least, we have three statuses. We have draft, paid, and sent. So three different options, and then I can add more or a few of them, change them, replace them, do lots of different things. But it's going to be good enough. Okay, now you can see right here I get the output and the date due. It wasn't set, so it's basically the default date time in C#, and then date created, it's been set automatically, so it does exist. And then we have the ID for the invoice. We don't have really any other data, and that may be a mistake, that may not be a mistake. That is something I will likely add later. I will also add some more things later that don't exist, that were missed or perhaps excluded as well. So you will see some of those videos, and I'll also add some things behind the scenes before I actually show you the publishing process of this whole arrangement. Now we also have the date picker. This is all Blazor. You can watch my video on how to implement Blazor, how to implement tables in Blazor as well. This is one of the more recent videos I've made. So we have a date, we pick the date, and we get our invoices. Now let's go to something a bit more exciting. Let's say paid. Okay, and we have this one right here. And if I click right here, I get the export right here, I get the link. And if I click on that, I'll get to the actual document. We will get to the documents a bit later. It's sort of a separate thing. First, we will look at the whole basically database level arrangement, and then the export will follow after we deal with all the databases, with the interface and all that stuff. Now, again, if I go into send, we'll have a couple more items, a few more actually. And we have the total, we have the sorting for the total. So again, if you want to learn specifically about these filters and sorts on these Blazor tables, take a look at my video. And right here we just have these filled invoices. Okay. And if I go to edit, it will take me to actually the new invoice page. But first, let's start with a new invoice, with a brand new one. As you can see, I just enter the page. This is what it looks like from above. And we can start from shipping address. So let's say test. Okay, and why not? And once I exit, once I lose focus, so it basically binds, at that point it is saved. Now, you may notice a bit of a flaw. It doesn't actually say anywhere, right? It doesn't say that it's saved. But again, this is something that you can easily add later, so there's no real reason to sort of bother with it at the moment. Okay, we have the basic product. We have something that we can release into the beta testing, and that's good enough. After that, we can search for little bugs and perhaps features that are missing, and then we can add them. Okay, but at that point, someone hopefully will be already testing. If you have beta users, they will be testing for other problems of your application, right? So with that base code, not just what's missing. We also have comments, which is not implemented, okay? It's not implemented. The comments I can enter, but it's not actually implemented in terms of generating into that PDF invoice. Then we have the date due. Right here, we can pick that, say 12th of June, why not? And then we have the draft. And then we can do paid or sent. And again, once it changes, it goes to the database, it all gets saved. Now, as you can see, the total is 0, and that will be added once we add the items. But before we add the items, we need the company data. And you can do the company name. All of these are not mandatory, okay? You can actually exclude them and it will be generated, but you have to sort of be careful with these things, because by default you would most likely have them strings as nulls, right? So you have to make them empty strings rather than nulls. I will explain that all later, but there are some pieces and things that have to be handled carefully, right? Anyways, let's get into the items. You can see right here we have the new item field, and then we have price, quantity, sales tax, which could be VAT or something else, basically a tax that's added on top of the sale, right? So we have quantity, tax, discount. And there's a simple formula that divides and multiplies things and calculates the total of that particular item. So let's say it's 100. With 50% discount. Okay, let's say test item. If I can do item, and then test D for test description. And then I click add, it actually shows the total for the item, which is 50, right? 100 of 50% discount is 50. I add it, and it is now in the list. It is now in the list. You can see right here, we see 50, we see 0 sales tax, and then we see 50 discount and 100 the price. Now you may notice there is something missing, and that is the currency, right? So the currency I forgot to add, which was my mistake, right? And I will show you in a later video how I correct that mistake, which is not perhaps the easiest thing in the world to do. It's not too difficult, but it is actually time consuming, that is. So it's always, well, better to have a proper plan before you start coding, which I did not really have for this particular project, okay? So we have title, description, item, and all the rest. And then if we go to the bottom right here, we have total 50, okay? So that will add up all the items. And if I click export, it will give me the document. That will be a link, and we'll get to that later, I guess, in the second part of this video, of this course, if you will. Okay, so you see what it does, you see what it can provide, and now let's get into some code and see how things come together. So before we get into the C# part of things, it is important to see the code for the databases, for the database rather, and for the tables. We have 3 tables, and there is a specific structure in terms of how they interact with each other. And this is basically what the whole project is based on. Now, the first and the main one, in a way, we have the invoices table. Now, invoices table will have the unique identifier for each record. That is the ID for each invoice. That is what the users see. That is what everyone sees. Then we have the owner. This one is extremely important because once the application is released, one user will only be allowed a certain amount of invoices to have to the account, right? That's very important because that's it might get troublesome if there is no limit, right? So we have the owner, and only the owner will also be able to see the invoices, which makes sense, right? We don't want everyone in the world to see someone's invoices. We just want the owner to see them, and that's great. Now, we also have company to and company from. Company from is the company that invoices the company to. So the company to is the company that covers the invoice, that pays for the invoice. Okay, and we have NMOCHA because that will be an ID, and companies will be listed in the companies table. Right here we have a companies table, and we have ID for each company. Again, it's a unique identifier. It will be assigned for each company. Then we'll have company name, company ID, which is company code, one of those government issued government IDs. Now, I do notice that in certain countries it's not really used all that widely, even on invoices. But for example, the country I live in, it is sort of mandatory to put it on the invoice. Otherwise, you can't really be clear which company it is. So it is kind of an important thing, and especially for me, if I would send an invoice to someone, I would put that on. I would have to put that on. If the system I am using does not allow for that arrangement, well, I'm not going to use that system. It will be impossible. The next thing is, of course, extremely important, which is the address, and we also have the country, just in case, okay? Now, at the moment, it's set to NMOCHA. We don't have a country picker. I might make a video on how to make your country picker or something like that. We'll see about that, but we do have that field right there. And then we have the invoice ID. Okay, so it's referenced like this. It's referenced from the company. Okay, each company belongs to a specific invoice, and that is referenced in this record. Okay, it's not listed somewhere in the invoice records, but it is listed in here. But also, at the same time, we do have, if we go back to the invoices, we have these, right? Company from and company to. So in general, we will be using these two. We will create a company in the companies table, and then if it's company to, that will be put in this field. If it's company from, it will be put in this field. Now, that can be used later on for some additional things. It's not really that important, but I would prefer to leave it right away because it will be easier later on. Now, there is a problem with the currency. I am aware of that, and I will show you how that will be fixed. But again, if you know about it, if you think something will be done later on, it's better to do it right now. Then we have the date created, which is date time. Okay, so the date the record was created, and I always like to put these things because it makes your life easy if you have to test for sort of live issues. If your customer complains and you have to test it, and it makes your life a lot easier if you have to go through that data and analyze the issue. It's just a great thing to just have dates anywhere where it's possible. And then we have the VAT ID. That's a government issued VAT ID. That's obviously going to only apply to European Union, but it is something that's very useful to have. And that is for the companies. Now, getting back to the invoices, we have the shipping address. Okay, we don't have that feature where you could set company address to shipping address. We just have a separate one for now. And then we have the comment record, which we don't actually use in generating the invoice. Another thing we don't use is the logo ID. Right here we have the logo ID, which we do not use right now, but I just added it right away because I do believe I might actually implement that at some point, and if I do, I will make a video on that. Now, we have also date created, and then we have the date due. Date created is set automatically. Once the invoice record is created, the date created is set, and then date due is set by the user. And final thing, for now at least, we have the status. Okay, we have the status. Now, the status is the most important thing here because that is basically how we determine what the invoice is, what the status of it is, and that will help in the search of invoices as well. Now, I'm gonna skip those two for now, and let's go into the invoice items just quickly. You saw the invoice items, so when I showed what the application actually does, we have title, description, price, discount, tax, total, and then we have the owner. Okay, the owner for this item. So you see the owner is added pretty much wherever it is possible because it is quite important to have that ownership structure of these records. We don't want them falling to the wrong hands, and we want them to be sort of easily accessible as much as possible. And then we have date created, just like we have for every other record. Now, after that, quantity, and then the invoice ID to which this item belongs. That's the only point of reference in terms of the item. So unlike the companies, we have sort of 2 points of references, two-way referencing kind of thing going on. In the invoice items, we do not have that. Now, getting back to invoices, right here we have the total, which is the sum of those items that are associated with this particular invoice, and then we have a discount, which is a standalone discount, which then can be applied to the whole invoice. Okay, so just a sort of global discount for the total value for every item. Not for a specific, we do have discounts for specific items, but we also have a global discount as well. Now, you see the structure, you see we have 3 tables, we have lots of procedures, we have lots of things to go through. So now we will start with the creating of a new invoice. I'll show you how all of that works and functions and how things go into the database, and then we'll get into the list and into all these different things. Now that you know a bit about the databases and what they look like in this arrangement, I will show you the initial setup of the new invoice page. So right here we have the new invoice page .razor, which is the Blazor page, which you saw. That is the page where you insert the new invoice, the data for the new invoice, and then you can export and do all these different things. Now, I will show you how the data gets into that sort of binding arrangement with a bind, and how we bind it and why we do it that way, and how we update things later on. That's very important. But first of all, how we generate those initial records, right? Because basically what we do in this page, we go into it, and then on initialize the sync right here, we generate the initial records. We generate the invoice, then we generate the companies for the invoice, and then we go on from there, right? We only let the user access anything after we generate those records, and then those IDs are laying around in here, and that would be right here, invoice data. So that will be our invoice model, class model, right? We call it invoice. So this is the object into which all the inputs will go into. And then we'll have invoice item, which is the new item. We'll get to that later. But this invoice thing is the main thing. And let's go first of all into this model. Let's go to definition right here like this. You can just go to definition and you'll get into the class. Now you will see that I do have sort of an overload on the constructor. I'll explain that later. And you see there's a update total right here. But basically what we have here is lots of data for the invoice. ID, shipping address, comment, logo, invoice date, day due, and then you can see we have the list for the items, and then we have the invoice companies, company to and company from. Also discount, status, and total, which is calculated whenever there's a change in the items list, right? So whenever there's a change in there, it will be recalculated, so to speak, right? So that's all good and great, and we'll get to this probably a bit later, but basically it just calculates the total for the invoice. Okay, now then let's get into that initialized, uninitialized async, and let's see what it all looks like. We are now in the new invoice page .razor, and we are in the uninitialized async right here. And as you can see, the first thing we have is connection, right? The SQL Server connection. So we established that before the try and catch statement. Then we'll close it in sort of different ways for different outcomes. We take the connection string from the environment variables, so you just provide that for wherever you publish your database. If you want to see how to publish a database somewhere, you can take a look at my video I have here, and if you want to learn more about SQL Server, you can take a look at my whole course on this SQL Server. From basics to the more advanced stuff, I will show you everything you need to know. So we start the connection. It's kind of an interesting structure in how we establish the connections. We establish them for sort of each specific procedure, right? Or bulk of smaller procedures. So we don't use it for every tiny input and output and update, opening and closing them. We just use one connection for several things, but also we don't use a global connection because that can cause problems too. So in the try and catch statement right here, let me expand like this. We have an if statement, right? We have an if statement, and we have the else for the if. You see right here, it's the invoice ID. This will be for updating the existing invoice. We'll get to that later in this whole arrangement. Now, we get to the else and we open the connection. We need to open a connection in order to do something. And then we construct something called invoice data upload. Okay, we have services, invoice data upload, which is a class which in turn contains several methods, which then will upload that data. It will insert the main records into the database, and then I'll show you a very interesting arrangement on how I made the updating of these fields for records. Very simple actually. So the first thing we have to do is invoice ID. We need to assign that invoice ID. Okay, we need to add the invoice, which basically just creates an empty record as I mentioned previously, and then it assigns the ID to this variable in this page. Let's go into this. Let's just go to definition. It's very easy to do. As you can see, this is the invoice data upload. Now on the constructor, it simply takes the connection, puts it in here, and now it's accessible throughout the class. Perfect and simple, right? And we are looking now at the add invoice to database, which is again quite simple really. We have the command, right? Just the usual sort of SQL Server arrangement. Command, of course, command type, which you must not forget, otherwise terrible things will happen. And then we'll have parameters. We add the value, and what we add is the owner. Okay, it's the owner. Now the owner is user ID, which as you can see, it comes from this authorize class. Now the authorize class is basically how the whole thing will be secured. Okay, it's how it will be secured. I'm probably not going to go into the security arrangement because it will be once I actually show you how it's being uploaded, it will be tied into my main Confucian Solution platform, where you can buy my courses and do some other things as well. And there are some new things coming through, and it's basically a sort of a third-party single sign-on kind of an arrangement. So I'm probably not going to show you that, but basically from the authorize, we just do that sort of inheritance thing, and we take the user ID. Okay, the logged in user ID, and that will be referenced, as you will see later, on many occasions for safety, security purposes, right? So let's go back to the invoice, add invoice. As you can see, that executes the script, which returns a string. Now, a string is an ID, and I'll show you the stored procedure in which we have the ID. We have it right here, insert new invoice. That's where we have it. Insert new invoice. As you can see, it takes the owner of the invoice, which is great. And then we simply insert these sort of default fields in a way. We have the ID, which is generated with a new ID. Remember, it was unique identifier type, and this is how you generate that unique identifier. In that case, you don't need to add any kind of a loop and special arrangement and constraint and then all these different things to make the ID truly unique. It just all happens for you automatically. And then, of course, we add the owner. And then we add the date created. Now the date created, as you can see, is sys UTC date time. UTC. UTC is crucial. In any application that you do, you must always use UTC. If you want to display that date, sure, go ahead, convert it to the time zone of the user. Other than that, you always store UTC in the databases. I have consulted many projects where this was the issue. And believe me, the fix was actually very, very difficult, because you had to change the existing dates, and you had to basically think of some ways to even to remotely fix it, because this can cause many issues. Now, I talk about this all the time, so I'm not going to get into this too deeply, but the next thing is the output. The output basically it's like select, right? Instead of selecting, you output, and what we output in this case is the ID, right here, the ID. And then once we execute scalar, right? Async, of course, we do everything async in this arrangement. We get that value, and you need to convert, as you can see right here, to string. Value to string. It fails, it becomes null, and then we handle it from there. So this is how we do that initial record of a database. And then we'll have the company, right? So let's just take a look at that. It's sort of a similar thing, right? We have insert invoice company, invoice ID. The invoice ID comes in, so as you can already see, you first need to generate the invoice, and then you need to add that. And then once again we execute scalar, because if we look at here, it's kind of the same arrangement. Takes ID, invoice ID in this case, instead of the owner, but again, almost exactly the same. And then it takes out the ID, the generated ID, and then it uses it and actually will put it into the invoice. So if we go back to the new invoice page right here to the on initialized sync, as you can see, we add the invoice, we've dealt with that, and then we check for null if it is null. And just in case I added this, because it might have changed and all that stuff, so we have the ID, that's great. If we don't, we return. Now, I haven't added any kind of a failure message yet. I kind of skipped on those things because it does bloat the code quite a bit. I did add a few error messages, and I'll show you how you can make that happen. But it does bloat the code quite a bit, all these error displays and things like that. Now, the next thing, of course, is adding the company. So, company 2, we construct new invoice company like that. Okay, and then we just, as you can see, we use the add company to database method from the uploader, and then we assign that ID to the newly constructed company. So that should be all good and great. Hopefully That's all good. And then as you can see later on, we use invoice data upload, update invoice data. So we don't use it from the uploader anymore. We use it sort of, well, directly like this. And you'll see in this method we have invoice ID, of course, as a sort of normal parameter in a normal method. But then we have this company to. Okay, we have company to. That's a bit weird, you might think, right? Why would I do this? The reason I do this is so I could have one method to update any of those fields in the database without touching any other field and without having 10 or 20 different stored procedures. So let me show you how this is done, because this is probably one of the more interesting parts of this whole video that I'm making. So we are now in the invoice data upload class, and we are looking at the update or pay date invoice data. Now I am very well aware that there is indeed a typo right here, and I just went with it because who really cares, right? So I can change it later. Anyways, we have the update invoice data, the method, it returns a Boolean value, that's all great and good, but then it takes the ID, which is the invoice ID, okay? It's the invoice ID, and in fact, I'll do something on the go here. I'll make a few comments. You see, I added 3 slashes and it gave me this sort of nice comment template. I'm gonna write invoice ID, okay? Just in case someone takes over and they don't know which ID it is, because we have quite a few. We have user ID, all these company IDs, and then invoice items IDs and all that. Okay, so we have update invoice data, which is great and good. And then we have owner. Then we have company to, and I can go on and on and on. And then it goes to company from, and then shipping address and all that. You get the idea. It's all basically the fields that would be updated in this record, right? In this row, table row. But as you can see, all of them have default values, and those values are null. Now, if you think about it, what would happen? What would happen if right here, let's go a bit to the bottom, right? Right here, I add with value. If you're familiar with SQL Server, you know what happens. In the parameters, we have add with value, and then say this is null, or this is null. What will happen is, it will say the value is missing. It expects a value, but it is missing. The reason for that is because the null in C# does not correspond with the null in SQL Server. It just doesn't, okay? And that means it's missing. It's sort of a different kind of a null, basically. It's not the kind of a null that could be inserted in the database, in the table, but it's still recognized as something that's empty or not existing, and you can find that out in the SQL Server procedure. Okay, so we assign that null, and if you don't provide it in the parameters, by default it will be null and nothing will happen, and I'll show you why it won't happen. We need to go into the update invoice. Okay, we need to go into the update invoice, which is great, right? And we have something default as well. You see right here, the owner, the parameter in the procedure has a value assigned. Now, this is something that you probably won't see very often. You don't really add these defaults like that too much. I don't believe in SQL Server, at least in these more basic arrangements. But we have the null assigned to this. Okay, so if it doesn't find anything, if it comes from C# part of things with a null, that means it doesn't find it, but it does not default to a null. Okay, by default, it does not default to a null if a null is from C#. So we have to assign the default null if this particular value is missing. Okay, And now at this point, if it's missing, if it was not provided, we will carry that SQL Server null. But then there's another issue, right? If you just insert it, if you just set that particular field, then it will be updated to null, which we don't want to happen. So we have the update, right? Update invoices, and then we set, say, owner, and then we check for is null. Okay, so if it is null, right? Or rather, if it isn't, it doesn't really matter, right? If it is null, it will basically assign the existing value. You see, that's the name of that field. It will assign the existing value. If it's not null, meaning value is indeed provided, it will assign the new value. That's how it works. And you can see the same arrangement is throughout. There are several more classes, or rather methods. I'll show you them as well. And this is how we will do it. This is how we will do it. We'll use them as we go and as we need. And now, let me just save that quickly and let's go to the new invoice page. Let's get back to that. And you can see right here, I just want to show you how to actually use these parameters if you don't know how to use them. You have a method, right? You have whatever the first sort of simple parameter is. And then if you don't want to do them in a sort of row, right? And in the correct order, in the original order, if you only want to add the parameters that you want, this is how you assign them. So you do the specific parameter and then you provide the value and then you use colon. It's kind of like an equal sign in a way, or think of it as maybe JSON, right? Company to is this value, company from is that value. So this is how we use it. And if we go back to the invoice data upload, right here in the invoice data upload, you can see we have also update invoice item, which we will probably look at later just a bit. And then we also have, if I can find it properly, update company data. Now, there are some more tricky bits in here, okay? There are some more tricky bits, and let's take a look at them. First of all is the date due, which is date time, okay? Date time. You see, by default, date time doesn't have a null. You probably know this from C# if you've used it long enough. You may have noticed that sort of, I would say, a bit of an annoying thing about it, but it does not have a null. It just has this sort of newly constructed date time, which is a 000 date. But basically this acts as a null. This you can use as a null. Okay, so if I expand this once again, you can see right here, we have date due. If it is equal to that value, if it is indeed equal to that value, we will then, basically if it's not provided, it's null, right? We will then provide the database null. And this is how you basically push through into that parameter, the SQL Server null. That is the SQL Server null. DB null value, DB null value, that is the SQL Server null. It's not, let's see if I can do it. It's not this null. It's not. It's different. The idea is the same, but it is different. It doesn't convert, so to speak. But this is how it works, okay? So if it does exist, obviously we just provide the date due. Another thing is the numbers, the digits, okay? The digits. They don't have nulls either, just like the date. And we also can't really use the default, which is 0, because it could be 0 quite possibly, right? It could be 0. So we can't use that. We lose all those options. What do we do then? Well, it's quite simple, okay? It's quite simple, and it is right here. We have object. So you see, instead of a double, instead of an integer, we just have an object. And then the object can definitely be null. Objects can be null, and if we need to access the double from the object, we just cast it to double. Perfect, right? Perfect. And if you're struggling to understand some of this stuff, you can take a look at my C# course where I show you, so from the very basics to something a bit more advanced, how to use C#, everything you need to know. It's not a bloated course. There's not a lot of technical terminology. It's just basically how to use it, where to find things, and how things work and how things function. And you will be able to use that, and you'll be able to get some exercises from that as well. You can find all the links in the description. So this is how we update the data. And now we'll get into the next step, which is actually taking a look at that layout, Blazor layout, the UI elements, which in this case we are using a third party, which is something I don't really like doing, but this is a decent third party. It actually works, and it is Blazor. You can take a look at some of my videos on how to interact with Blazor and how to set it. In the new invoice page, you'll find the mud grid right here. Now, mud grid is kind of like a bootstrap row in a way, at least, and then you have these items in the grid, and then you see the item is 12. That's 12 out of 12, so it will take up the whole row. If it's not, like here for example, we have MD4, that's just 1/3 of the row. So it's kind of like bootstrap, pretty much exactly the same thing. So let's start with the first part right here. We have mud item, and in the mud item we have paragraphs, and then we have mud button. Now if you want to learn how to use this whole mud Blazor thing, take a look at a couple of my videos about the tables and also about the general setup of it with the buttons. But as you can see with Blazor, you can put in just basic HTML in there, so kind of do both things at once, which is a great thing because you can modify and customize whatever you need, whatever you want. Now this will be for the export, and then we have the error message for the export, and then we'll have a link. I'll explain the exporting later. But for now we have the total, invoice total displayed right here. So once you start adding those items, you'll see that later, you will be able to see the total for all the items. So that's how it all works. Now the next thing, that will be, as you can see, shipping address. Okay, shipping address. So we have a sort of a row here. These three will be, I can sort of separate that a bit. It is a bit difficult to separate things in these in this HTML part, or in this case Blazor part, but I think it's quite obvious what things are doing here. So for the first one we have shipping address, which is the mud text field, which is basically a text box, right, an input of text. And you'll see right here we have a value changed, okay, value changed, on which we take that new value from the text box and we assign it to shipping address. And also right here, if I can just go a bit to the left, you will see that I am using that update method. You see, update method, and I simply update the shipping address, provide the invoice ID, update the shipping address. Now, since this is a text field with multiple lines, you also need to declare the number of lines that you want to have, just a basic kind of an arrangement. And also a very important thing is the type. So in this case it's the text, therefore we use string as the type. That's what we do. Now you will also see the value, so you might think, why do we have on changed the value and then we have the value right here, put in here? The reason is because we will be using the same exact page for editing. And so for editing, the data will come into this page. It will come into this page, and therefore it will have to be displayed. If we don't do that, it will not display, right? It will be just empty, and then on the value change, it will start from the empty, and everything will be empty, and it will be very troublesome. So you'll see these values provided right here. I'll talk a bit about more a bit later. So we have the mud item, and then we have date picker. We need the date due, so it's all again the same process. So we assign the value, to the object, to that current invoice data, and then we update it. Okay, now as you can see, there's not much error handling going on, but again, this is just a sort of basic product that you can release. Okay, that's what I'm going for, that's what I'm looking for. So I am skipping a few things because otherwise it will be a never-ending process. You'll work on it, and then it will become too expensive, at least in terms of your time, and you'll just drop the project and never release it. So it's good to have some limitations for your expectations. So don't overwork it, just do whatever is possible at minimum to release it, and go ahead and release it, and then you can deal with all the bugs and new features and all that stuff. The next thing is the mod select. So it's just sort of a drop-down selection. This is kind of a complex thing. You need to provide the value, the sort of original value, once again, because we will be using that for updating the existing invoices, editing them. But then you see we have the type, okay, the type, and then again on value changed, we will be changing the values and updating. And the contents of it, the child elements you might call them, we have mod select item. So you have mod select, and then mod select item is what you select. But one thing you can notice here, I have value, which is 0, and then 1, and then 2, and then I have this word. So word will be very important, right? Because you don't want to use in the program or store it in the database the actual word that you provide to the user, a friendly name, if you will. But you do want the value. So you use the value as something the user cannot see, but if they select draft, they will get 0. If they select sent, they will get 2. That's how it all works. Okay, so on to the next one. We have mod text field once again. This one will be the comment, and the comment, again, the same exact thing. Let's go down. Now, these are the company details, company from on the left and company to on the right. Again, I didn't add too many words floating around, too many labels and things like that. There's no need for that. For the initial release, this will be good enough because, you know, chances are no one's going to use your product right away. You might have a few friends and colleagues to test it out, but probably initially it will be just launched and it will sit there for a while, and then maybe you'll get some traction, maybe you'll work out the bugs, but you will have time to do it because you will be able to relax. Your product is out there, it's published, it's all good to go, it's working to some decent extent, and then you can add more features, make it all pretty, and do all these different things. Now, in here we have a few mod text fields, a few text boxes, right? And they just do exactly the same thing. The only difference from my previous ones is that they go to company from, okay, company from, and so we do update whichever one it is, but company from is in the invoice, and then we'll have company to. It's exactly the same thing. The only difference there will be the word from and then to. This one is from, the other one will be to. So after that, we have invoice data upload, update company. You saw those static methods, the update methods. And then in this case, we just pick company, country rather, and address, and all these different things. Then we have a label for the text field, which is kind of a useful thing. You don't have to write another HTML element for the label. Sort of gives you it in the actual text box. I do kind of like that. It saves a bit of time and sort of messiness in the code. And then 6 lines and string. That's all we need to have in here. Let's go to the next one, which is the company to. I already explained that. It's exactly the same. And you can find the source code on Patreon, and as I mentioned before, this will actually be published. So I'll show you the sort of publishing process in the IIS Manager, how that may work, and more importantly, I'll show you the ways to monetize the Blazor project, because we can put all these different links in a simple JavaScript arrangement, but it doesn't work exactly the same way with Blazor applications. So I think that's going to be something that's really interesting and very useful to see. Now, the next one, we have a whole row saying new item, and this is where adding of the new item begins. So we have basically some pieces of the item, and then we have the whole display right here. We'll have this is the total for the item, and then we'll have the whole display. So now at this point you sort of see what it all looks like in terms of this initial Blazor arrangement plus the initialization of the invoice. And now we can go and take a look at how the items are added, what's the procedure in there, how it all works. In general, doing a list in Blazor is actually very easy. That's what Blazor is good for, one of its advantages, right? You just add it to the list and it gets displayed. But this arrangement is a bit different because we don't have a save button, right? We don't have any kind of a simple action where we just insert the form, fill out the form, and then save it to the database. So we do everything sort of on the go, and the list, as you can see right here, it will be saved on the click of the add button. That is, the item to the list will be saved. So first of all, it needs to be saved into the database, and only then we can actually display it. Otherwise we'll need to display an error because it did not work for whatever reason, and this will be the error right here. As you can see, I'm displaying the errors in a very simple and straightforward way. Simply a paragraph and the color is red, and if there's no error, the paragraph will not be seen. If there is an error, if there is an error message, it will be seen in red. Very simple solution, and I use it all the time these days. Now, after that we'll have a table, and we'll get to the table once I actually show you how it's all inserted, where it goes and what it does. Now for this we have new item, new invoice item. Invoice item is the model that we're using for that, and everything right here you can see we have all the data bind value. We use bind value in Blazor. Mud text field we use once again, and in this case we use bind value because we just put it into that new item. It's not saved into the database just by changing the value, say in price or quantity or sales tax or whichever one else it is. It will be saved again on the add button. The whole object will be saved. A new item will be created and then added to the list. Now it all works by reference, so we'll need the invoice ID. But basically, again, we bind the values, and then on the click of add button, right here, on the click of the button, we execute the add item method, which will be down here below, okay? And the first thing we do in the add item method, we set the add item error to nothing, right? The reason we do that is because if there was previously an error and now we won't have an error, we need to have it as empty. That makes sense, right? If it was just sitting there, it might just sit. If you don't have any kind of a success message, which we don't really have here, we just see that the item is added to the list. So it makes sense to have that set to nothing, to empty text, or empty string in this case. And after that, we establish our connection. Okay, we establish our connection from the environment variables. This is, remember, server-side Blazor, so we do have that option of using environment variables. It's quite easy to do. It's just like any other API application or something similar. And so after that, we establish a try and catch statement, which is obviously very important. We need to catch those errors at least to some extent. And then we open up a connection. Now after that we use invoice data upload once again, and then we use this method add item to database. It takes in all the data. Let's go into that just quickly. Again, it's just it's all very sort of the same way, right? We don't have many differences between these procedures. We have insert new invoice. It takes all these different pieces of data, but two most important pieces here, will be the invoice ID right here, invoice ID, because that is how we reference, okay, we don't have the list in the invoice record. We just have the invoice ID for the items of the invoice to which they belong. That is our reference point. And then we have the owner. Now, the owner at this point we don't really use, we don't really need it. But if I would want to later add a feature where, say, you can pick the existing items from a list, you'll need that owner, okay? That owner will be needed so that the list of previously inserted items could be retrieved for that specific user only, not everyone's items can be retrieved by everyone. That would be a big sort of security leak, and that is something we do not want. Now after that, of course, we just execute scalar, and what we get is the ID. In the output, inserted ID, the same thing we did with the other stuff, so there's not much to look at here. We can go back, and as you can see, we simply assign the new item ID. We check for it if it's not null, if it's not an empty string, and if that is all true, we only then add it to the list. You see, only then we will add it to the list. And then we will reset the item. You see, we will reset the item, therefore all the text boxes will be reset. On the other hand, if it fails, we go into the else, right? We don't get the ID, means it failed. And then we just say something went wrong, try again. We don't have too much of a handling here, but we do have something. And then, of course, we have the exception, and then once again, it's the same exact message. Now, do notice I already have a breakpoint right here. That is how I like to debug my stuff. I have the exception right here, and I have a breakpoint. So if I launch it on the first try, it will go through, it will break here, and I'll be able to just hover on that E and see what the exception is. I won't have to relaunch it, reset the breakpoint, go through the procedure again. None of that time wasting. We just go and see and then hopefully fix it, right? But this all has been tested and fixed and it's all working. Now the next thing will be the removal of the item. But first let's go into the table and see what the table itself looks like. And if you want to learn more about these mud tables, take a look at my video on YouTube. It's about the mud tables, mud Blazor tables. You'll learn all about the sorting and filtering and all these different things. Quite a useful thing to know, and it's a great tool to use. I mean, it really helps you out. The tables look decent. They have all these features and many options in them. So I would definitely use them if it's nothing especially beautiful in terms of my application. So we have the items, okay, you set the items, and then you set the header content. The header content is the table header, basically the first row of the table, and we have title, description, price, discount, sales tax, and total. We have the total. Now, after that, we use context, you see? These are the cells. These are the cells, and this is the row. So it's kind of like a for each loop, basically. It loops, and instead of that sort of general definition of a for loop or for each loop, rather, you have items. So in this case, the word is context. The same exact thing. On each cycle, you'll get to pick your data. And we just place it right here. The only sort of more difficult part here is the discount. As you can see, we have a discount in percentage, and then we have a discount in the actual currency, which, by the way, we do not have the currency because I forgot to add that field, and I later on just thought I would add it later and make another video out of it to show you basically how much time it takes to sort of fix that kind of a mistake. When you forget to add one field, it's not a quick procedure. You have to go through everything again and again and again, and it will take a bit of time, so you hopefully get an idea of that in that next video. So we have a discount, and then we have a sales tax. Once again, we have it in percentage, and then we have it in the currency. And then finally, we have the total. Now, the total, if I go into the total and go to the definition, I have to show you this as well, because the total is calculated in the model, in the class model right here. It's calculated like this. Basically, whenever there's a change in discount, quantity, price, or sales tax in any of those variables, it will be recalculated. That's why I like this approach. Now, there are a few perhaps problems and issues with it. You can't really set it. You have to make a different arrangement if you want to set it from some kind of a different place, right? But this works quite well. This does work quite well. As you can see, there's a whole formula here, and again, you can find all the source code on Patreon, and then you'll also be able to find a link and see how this platform looks when it's published. So let's just go back quickly to the invoice right here. The final thing we have is the mod icon button, which is just a button, and it will have an icon displayed instead of piece of text. It will have an icon. And so on that we have on click, and in there we have remove item. As you can see, it takes the ID and it will be removing the item. So now let's take a look at how you remove the item. The procedure to remove the item will be very similar to adding the item. If we go into this method, remove item, where we provide the string ID, the item ID, not the invoice ID, the item ID, that comes from the context in the table. We saw that before. So basically, once again, we create the connection. We don't have an error message of any kind in this case, which isn't the best thing, but that's how it is for now. Now, the next thing, open a sync. We open the connection. We construct, in this case, we construct the invoice data manager, because that's where we will have the method for removing the invoice. And this is where we have that method being used. So we have remove invoice item, we provide the ID, and that gets removed. Let's go into the definition right here. See, we have a public boolean, it returns a boolean, and it uses the remove stored procedure, remove invoice item. It removes, and we don't have any kind of a specific result. We just have a result of how many rows were affected. And this is what we get from the execute non-query async. We do expect it to be 1, therefore we check for it to be 1, and then we return true. Another safety sort of security feature that I added is this owner. See, user ID, owner, and then we have the item ID. So it will only remove the item that has this particular ID, but also it belongs to that particular user, so that we don't get any kind of an abuse in a way, right? Just in case there is that little safety feature. So getting back here, once that executes and once it gives the green light, the true value on the boolean, we can then go and remove the item from the list. And we just use a bit of link, kind of an arrangement, and we get rid of that item in the list. After that, we close connection and we're good to go. And once again, as you can see, I already have a breakpoint in the E, the exception. Okay, so this is how you add the items, this is how you remove the items. And now if we go to the top, okay, if we go to the top, I believe this one right here, see we have the invoice total. So each item added will add to that list, and therefore the total will add up and it will be displayed in here. So now you know how we set up the invoice. Okay? We don't have any kind of a final thing here, because it all goes into the database one by one. We add the item, it goes in. We change a piece of text, that goes in. So we don't have any kind of a save button, finalize button. Maybe I'll add that later, but basically now we just work by status, and that's all that there is to it. So now let's go into the list of my invoices, as I called it in the interface. Let's take a look at that. Let's see how the list gets displayed, and then let's see how the invoice can be edited and how I reused the whole page, basically just a few tweaks on initialize the sync to actually allow the user to edit the invoice. For the invoice list, we will begin from the C# part of things rather than that mud Blazor arrangement. So what we have here, we have a list. Right here we have the list, the first thing and the most important thing here. And then we have a couple of search parameters, because we do have the search, and the search will occur on a click of a button. It does not get initialized on initialize the sync or maybe on the change of something. You click a button and then it retrieves the data. It's a simple and straightforward way to do it. We have the invoices that will be displayed, and that is invoice list item. Invoice list item we use, it doesn't contain all the data for the invoice. It just contains a few things as you have seen. And then we have the search date range. This date range is a mud Blazor thing. It's from the date picker. I'll show you that a bit later. But basically it has date from and date to. And then we have the status of the invoice. So whichever is selected, that will be searched and filtered and sorted and all that. So this will occur on the click of a button. You'll see that a bit later. But once again, we open the connection, okay, construct it, then open it, and then we are good to go. So in this case, we need Invoice Manager, Invoice Data Manager, which will provide us with a method to retrieve those invoices. This takes date from, date to, right? Date from, date to, and the search status. That's all the parameters that are involved, and we won't have anything else. Let's just go into the definition. I'll explain a few rather important things. Now you can see right here it returns the list that we want. It takes the parameters and then it's a retrieve invoices sort procedure. Now the sort procedure isn't really interesting. It's just select, and we select specific items. We also provide all these different things, and you may notice there is an additional piece of context here, an additional parameter, and that is the user ID of the owner, as it is called in the database record. This one is obviously extremely important because we don't want a security leak, and believe me, I have seen quite a few. I have seen quite a few happen this way. No one noticed, no one cared, until someone complained. And that's not when you want to find out about these, because this will be quite obvious. If a user searches for something that is their own, right, and these other parameters will match, this one will not exist, well, guess what? They will retrieve the data for the other users, which would be a huge disaster. So we do want that. Okay, we filter where the user ID is, and then we have date from and date to, and then we have the status as well. Kind of a simple arrangement. Now after that we establish the result, sort of temporary list. Then we have the reader. We will need the reader because we're reading a lot of data, right? It's not a scalar, so we need a reader. And then we loop through the reader. Now, if you want to learn more about handling the SQL SQL Server procedures, the C# and in general SQL Server, you can take a look at my SQL Server course. It covers all the basics of more advanced features, the automation inside the SQL Server, the jobs as they are called, and also how to interact with it from the C#. So, you can see right here, we just add everything to result, but one thing I really want to note here, actually two things. We have the get value, that's the first one. You see right here, we have the type unique identifier. That is not a string. That is not a string. Unique identifier is not a string, therefore we get value and we convert it to string so that we have a displayable ID. The next thing is DB null async. This is to check whether or not the database record is null, right? Whether it exists. You see the index 10, does it exist or not? If it doesn't exist, therefore it is DB null, it is null in the table, right? We will give it 0 because in the database it can be null, right? It can be null. It can also be 0, but it can be null in the database. But in C# you can't have a null, and also these nulls don't convert anyways. Remember, we saw that previously we did a very kind of a great updating thing with those methods, providing those parameters with nulls, and then C# nulls and database nulls. Those are different. Remember that. Always remember that. And then we get the decimal. We use decimal, so we have to convert to double. And as you can see, I check for the nulls everywhere I go. And of course, datetime does not have a null, so we have to use new datetime. Then now let's go back to my invoices page.razor, and once again you can find all this source code on Patreon. The lowest tier is $1, €1, and you'll get a free course of mine. You can pick and choose whichever one you want from the Confucian Solution Learning Platform, so you'll get all the things that you need. So now, once we retrieve the invoices, that is assigned to the list, and we get the list. Other than that, I don't display any errors. Again, it's as minimal as possible at this point. That's what I wanted to do. And later on, we will take a look at the export. Now then, we can take a look at this whole table right here. We have mud table, the same thing that you have seen with the items in the new invoice. Okay, and one thing I have to note is the data models invoice. Okay, so you see I'm using the namespace for the data model so that I wouldn't have to write these huge descriptions, which can be quite annoying, especially in this kind of a Blazor page code. You always want to make, well, try to make as little as possible of that code in this page, because it gets messy very fast. Obviously using more components would be helpful as well, but again, I wanted to keep everything as quick and as simple as possible. Later on you can split it around and put different things in different components. Say header content you might put in a different component and place it right here and do all these different things. But again, in this case, we just have header content, and we have something called mud table sort label. You can take a look at my video about the tables, about mud tables in Blazor, and I'll show you how to use the sort and how to use the filters and all those different things. But in this case, we just have the sort. So this kind of a funk arrangement. Again, just take a look at that video. It's too much to explain in this arrangement. It is quite complex, but it is very easy to use once you actually know what this stuff means. But basically it will sort the list from top to bottom, from lowest to highest, from smallest to biggest to largest, and all that stuff. But we are only sorting on the total, and we need these empty ones just to keep the style going. And then we have the toolbar content, which should have been the first thing, but it doesn't really matter. Here we have the mud date range picker. So you just bind that to the date range. You don't bind it to date time. This is not a C# specific type. This is a mud Blazor specific type. Wherefore you need to bind it to that date range. And then, as you have seen, it will have from and to, two dates in that one object. So kind of a simple thing, nothing too fancy in there. And then we have the mud select. You have seen this before. This is obviously an exact replica of what you've seen in the new invoice, because we do need all those different statuses, the draft, the paid, and the sent. And that binds to the search status. And then finally, on the mud icon button, we have on click, and then we simply just execute the search method on click, which retrieves all those invoices. Now, going into the actual data, this is where things get a bit more interesting. We have all these cells. They are cells called, right? All this data, it comes from the context, from the list, so this is kind of boring. And then you see we have this edit link. We have the edit link. So every invoice will have a link for the editing, which, as you can see, it takes to the new invoice page. New invoice page, as I mentioned many times previously, will be used for editing as well. Now below that, you can see the export arrangement, but the exporting of the invoices to PDF, that will be the final thing to get to. This is probably the most exciting thing on this whole application. So a weird arrangement is something that I do believe works extremely well. But in any case, once the user clicks on that link, they go to the new invoice page and they can edit it. So now let's see how the editing works. After the user navigates to this page, they will be able to edit the invoice. And in order to do that, we need to bring the data for that particular invoice into all these fields, or more specifically, we need to bring it into this invoice variable, right? We need to put that in, and then the user will be editing just the same way as they would with the new invoice. Once they change something in the text box, it goes into the database. Once they add a new item, it goes into the database. Once they remove an item, an existing one, it gets removed from the database. So that's how it all works. And the goal here is to bring everything into the invoice. But we can't just bring it all the time, every time, or at least attempt to do it on every going into this page, because right here you see we have new invoice page, so it's the same page and I'm reusing it, which saves a lot of time. But you see we have a parameter, so that parameter will either exist or it will not exist. And here in the bottom on the uninitialize the sync, we check for that to be either true or false, or either null or something. So if invoice ID, this is the parameter, as you can see, parameter public, and then get set. This is how you set a parameter if you don't know. And if you want to learn more about Blazor, take a look at my Blazor course. I'll teach you all these things about navigation and components and all these different arrangements. So we have invoice ID, and if it's not null, that means it was navigated from the list, meaning that we need to bring in the data for that particular invoice ID. We need to bring in the data, and for that, once again, we will be opening a connection. A connection is established right here. We will be opening it, and then we will have the invoice data manager, in which we will first use retrieve single invoice method. That will be retrieved and it will be assigned to the invoice. Let's go into this. This one is quite complex. It's a bit more complex than some of the previous ones. So we have retrieve, we have retrieve invoice items. That's not what we want. We want retrieve single invoice. That's what we want. This one right here, as you can see, it returns the invoice data. And we will need a reader, even though it's a one item, it's still not a scalar value, so we do need a reader. And then we have a result ID. See, we assign the ID from the method parameters to the ID, to that new object, and everything else we retrieve. But as you can see right away, it's not as simple as that. First of all, we need to retrieve the companies, right? We need to retrieve the companies to put into that invoice object. So for that, in turn, we use retrieve company. Let's go to that. We have retrieve company right here. As you can see, it returns invoice company. We have two different companies, company from and company to, but they are all stored, if you remember, in the same table. All the companies are stored in the same table. We just get the reference, that is the ID for one of those companies, and we use it in the appropriate place, either company from or company to. And we take the ID, put it in the stored procedure, which then simply retrieves the data for that company. That's all that there is to it. And as you can see, I have a breakpoint in this exception, just in case it breaks and I have to handle it. Let's move to the top. So let's see, we are back into the retrieve single invoice. And as you can see, we get the string, if we did get the string, that's great and good. Then we retrieve it. Now I'm not using the null because we can't have null. We can't have null for the company to and company from. It gets inserted on the initialization for the new invoice. So under normal circumstances, that just shouldn't happen. For everything else, I did put a null handler because that can become quite troublesome. And this is not the first time we're talking about it in this whole arrangement. As you can see, everything else is quite similar. We convert the decimal to double, as what we need to do. We get int 32 where it's appropriate, but we always handle the nulls. So let's go back. Let's go back to the new invoice page, or rather the old invoice page in this case, right? And as you can see, once we deal with the invoice retrieval, if it fails, it will either be null, it will be, the ID will be empty. We want to be, rather the ID, either null or empty. That's what we want to sort of check for in this arrangement at least, or we could just check for the whole invoice to be null. It doesn't really matter what we do. Both of them could be applied, but in any case, if it failed to do that, we just return and that's it. It will have failed. Now, as you can see, there is no error message, right? But this is not something that I expect to fail quite often. Therefore, I skip out that extra step, which I will add later. But again, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video and several times during the video, the important thing here is to get it released. Because many times you have a project, you work on it, you perfect it, you try to perfect it, you work and work and work, and then you decide to drop it because it's been doing that, you've been doing that for half a year, it got messy, you forgot what was going on, and it never got released. What a waste of time, right? So the goal is to get it released as soon as possible with as little effort, hopefully, as possible, right? So after we have the invoice, we can retrieve the items. So we have the items, and then we use retrieve invoice items method. We can just take a quick peek into that. You can see it returns a list of invoice items. Again, we will have just a procedure, and you can get all the source code from Patreon. You also get a free course, at least one free course for the higher tiers. You get several courses, and you also get an opportunity to request a specific video from me. So maybe you want some C# explanation, maybe you want perhaps some third-party tool explored. I will do that for you. So we have retrieve invoice items. That's just a store procedure that will retrieve the invoice items. And you see this is what it does. Now this one did not exist. I didn't want to mess with it. I just skipped it. Okay, we don't need the date. We don't use the date in the display. Okay, I just established it, but we didn't have it. So whatever, right? I just skip it. Just let it go. Didn't bother with it because we don't really need it. And then we return the result. That's all that there is to it. Just if we go back, as you can see, this is the last step. This is the last step. And then we have items. If it is null, we assign new list. Okay, we assign new list because it has to be new list because we're simply adding it. We're not checking for null on every new item add attempt. Now, the next thing is actually quite important. Now, you may know in C# when you have a list and you push it through some kind of a method and those parameters, it will not be basically a new instance of that list. It will just be the reference of the existing list. Therefore, we need a constructor, a separate constructor to sort of create those lists for the generator. We will need that. So update total, okay, update total will only allow the total of the invoice to be updated when it is set to true. Okay, when it is set to true, it will allow for that to happen. Now, if we go just into that invoice, let's go to definition. Let's see if we can go quickly. Let's do it like that. Go to definition again. And here we have it. You see, we have update total. is false. So if it's false, it won't be updating total. And then we have this overload of the constructor. There is a normal sort of class model, right, where you just take it, construct it, and assign the values. That's all great and good. Okay, but then we have the total, which gets calculated in this kind of a weird way, perhaps. But this is probably the only way to do it sort of properly and sort of on the go, which is what we really want. Otherwise, it would mess up the whole view of the code in that actual page. Now, we have this method. It takes, obviously, the items. So whenever the items change, this will get recalculated. The total will get recalculated right here. Okay, so it does the calculation anyways, but the point is basically to update the total. Okay, update the total in the database. Okay, in the database. Now, the reason for that is because initially, when that invoice is created, everything is null and it all will default to 0. Okay, so let's go back to that. I'll try to explain this as best as I can. Okay, so right here, this will get constructed. It will come from here. But the invoice might have a few items, so therefore it will have some kind of a total which is inserted into the database, right? So let's say it has 3 items and the total is 100. Okay, the total is already 100. If we were to just construct it and leave it be, what would happen if we go back to, see if we can go back to this right here. What would happen is this would run, okay, this would run update invoice data, and the total would be updated. And at that point, the total for the invoice would be set to, guess what? 0. It would default, this whole calculation would default everything to 0, and that may ruin the database record in the database. Therefore, we only want to update the total once we are sure that we have the whole list of items in this object. Once we're sure of that, we can set update total to true, and only then it will be updating. Once you add a new invoice, once you remove, or rather add item and remove item, so only then will it be updated. This is very important, and as I mentioned before, we do need this kind of a stuff because we do need this constructor. This is quite important, this constructor. As you can see, it creates a new instance of the list. See, a new instance of the list. It doesn't take the reference, because we will be using that list in a sort of perhaps a bit more of a weird way when we're generating the invoices. And speaking of generating the invoices, we have now gone through the initialization of that invoice. We have gone through editing, we have gone through the list, and now it's time to take a look at the export feature of that PDF invoice, how it gets generated, where does the controller come in, and all those different things. Before we get into the code, let's take a look at how it all works in the actual interface, right, in the application itself. So we have a new invoice, which is actually the edit page. New invoice page is the edit page, as you have already learned. And now if I click the export button, the file, the PDF file, will be generated. Okay, it was generated, and I will click on that link and it will be downloaded. What happens is the file gets generated somewhere in the server, and it will lay around with that link being available. Now at the moment it was laying around forever because, again, I didn't want to waste any time, and probably in the future I'll actually make a video on a Windows server, how to create one sort of for this kind of a thing, to remove the stale files that haven't been used for, say, half an hour or an hour. But basically the idea is that if someone exports it, opens it up, and then closes it, they can go back and click on the link rather than clicking on the export, which generates the file, which in turn uses a lot of resources. So the hope here is to save some server resources. That's all that there is to it. Now, if I click on the link, it takes me to a new page and I have my invoice right here. The invoice is nothing special, and again, just a basic layout for that basic first release. That's what the whole thing is all about here. But we have invoice, we have the ID of the invoice, and you could do something different with it, obviously, right? But I chosen this because that is the ID, the recorded ID in the record. That is what we use, so that is what I display. Then we have the ship to. As you can see, it doesn't do it doesn't go into a different line, doesn't do lines, so that's something you have to work out in a different way. I didn't bother with that because, again, it would be a waste of time for that sort of initial release. After that, we have business from, business to. Nothing was inserted, therefore it's empty. And then we will have some items. So just quickly, I can go and add some items right here. Let's do 50. Okay, let's say test and test, and let's click add. So now we'll have that, and as you can see, the last export was 255. Now it's going to be 257. As you can see, it did change. I'm going to go into that, and as you can now see, we have total 50. And if we go down, you can see we do have that first item. Test, description is test, the price is 50, quantity is 1, and then we have the sales tax, which is 0%, discount 0%, therefore the total is 50. So everything matches, everything works. Now let's just take a quick look at the list. Let's go to my invoices. As you can see, this sort of quick tab arrangement doesn't really work all that well, but doesn't really matter. So I have my date range picker right here. I have set to draft. Yeah, let's just go into draft, and this is the invoice that you saw previously. It's created today, just a few moments ago. We have the ID, and then if I click the export right here, you see it exports right in the list. I'll explain how that works a bit later. And if I click on that, we go into the invoice. Everything works perfectly. So now what I will do, I will go into the code and I will show you how this page gets generated, and then I'll show you how the interface works, so how it works in the list and how it works in the new invoice page. The whole code for generating a new PDF invoice file is contained in one simple class. Oh, not exactly simple, but at least in one single class. We have it in the services, in the invoice folder. As you can see, we have everything sorted quite properly in these folder arrangements. And let's start looking at it. Now, if you don't know how to use the PDF generator, do take a look at my video about that. Do take a look at my video about the setup and just adding the items, creating the list, going to multiple pages before going through this video, okay? Do that before. It will be more exciting to actually watch this particular arrangement because you will know all the complexities, and it is very complex. It is actually very difficult to use, and not just knowing what to do, but just in general thinking about it, looking at things. You don't really have any kind of a designer view. You have to just put in numbers and hope for the best, basically. Now, the whole thing right here, the class, right, and we have a couple of variables. The first one is the PDF document, so this is where the pages will go in, where perhaps the document data will go in, and finally this is the object that will be exported into a file. The next thing is the invoice data, and the invoice data will come in on the constructor. It will come in on the constructor just like it usually does, but then as you can see, we'll use that fancy constructor for a model. Remember, the list in C#, if you just pass it through a parameter, it will be a reference, and therefore when we're dealing with this kind of a thing, it might get ruined. The original list might get ruined, you might get items removed, and all those bad things can happen. And to avoid that, we need to get rid of that reference and create a new instance for ourselves. So this is how we do that. You saw that previously a few minutes ago in this video, in basically the previous section, right? So we have the invoice, and this is what we will work with. The main method here is generate. Okay, the main method of this class is generate. Let me just expand that a bit like that. You can see we have the first page region, we have add pages, and then we have the export. So the export is a sort of standalone method, and generate is a standalone method. The other ones, although they are set to public for some testing reasons, they should be private, right? They could be private at least, and they are basically referred to and used by this generate class. Okay, let's go into the first page. We add the page, and we have the first page. We must start with the first page, and we must add those different things. And you could add some of these things at once. Say you could add general information, business information, and the first page table at once. Just do task and all these different things, right? And if you want to learn about sort of running several things at once in C#, take a look at my C# course. You will also learn many more things about all these files and what to do with files, how to use files, how to use that sort of binary data with C#. Basically everything you need to know about C#. Now let's get back to this, and you can see we have the X graphics. We get X graphics from the page, and basically this X graphics class, it allows you to draw everything. So if you want to modify the page, you do it by referencing X graphics. Again, take a look at my video, you'll learn all about that. But we take that and then we provide it into the add general information. It is a sort of a reference, okay? It is a sort of a reference, so we don't need to return it, reassign it, or something like that. We just take the reference into the add general information, and you'll notice we always take the X graphics. We always take the X graphics. We do not take the page. That won't work. We need to take the graphics. There will be several reasons why it won't work, but that's how we have to do it. So do be mindful about that. If you need to reference something with these arrangements, use the X graphics rather than going by the page. Okay, PDF page it is. I used a variable because I was lazy probably, but it is a PDF page, the type of it. So let's go into the add general information. Let's just go to the definition, right? It will be in this first page region. Let's open it up, the first method. It does return a boolean. I didn't add any kind of an error handler in here anywhere because, again, as mentioned previously many times, this is made to be released. It's not made to be your perfect project sitting somewhere, who knows where. This is just what we need to do, where we can cut corners. Perhaps somewhere it will be a bit ugly, perhaps some errors won't be handled as well as they should be, but at the end of the day it will be released. It will be in that beta mode. Maybe someone will help you test it, maybe some random user will help you test it, and you will be getting some data and you will be happy because you have achieved something. Now we have that in general information, so let's just go to this whole thing. And basically we will be drawing strings. We will be drawing quite a few strings. In this case, we just draw the strings. We don't draw lines or rectangles or something like that. But you saw the invoice, right? This is the top line of the whole thing. We have the invoice and we have the invoice ID. So we just draw it. The invoice, the word will be a bit bigger font, the invoice ID will be a bit smaller. We add some styles, we use X font to create a font, and then we use X brushes to create the color. We use black, but again, this is all about the layout at this point. Some colors are a bit different, but it's not really about the design in terms of colors and the sizes of things. It's more about the layout, and that's what you should really focus on when dealing with this library. First, you focus on layout, and then you can maybe add styles if that's what you really need. Because doing the layout, it ain't easy, right? It is not easy by any means. You have to just basically guess the numbers. Now, I have done quite a few of these arrangements, so I do have a sort of a feel for it, but even then, it's easy to get lost in these numbers, and especially once we get to some of these other parts. So we have X point, right? This is from the left. This is the margin from the left, and this is the margin from the top. This is where the text will sit. And the same goes for the next one, for the ID. And after that, we have drawstring total, discount, business to, business from. Okay, just like that. Since it's all in the one line, for the total and for the discount, we don't need to draw additional strings to draw these totals. And in fact, this is actually probably a bit better, especially once I will add that feature of adding the currency, because then I won't have to worry about the distance between this text and the currency. Right now it wouldn't really matter because it begins at this point somewhere anyways. It's a fixed place, but once you have something beyond that non-fixed place, that's where you can have quite a few problems. So this is just a general data, quite a simple thing, nothing too difficult here. Okay, so what's the next one? The next one will be the shipping information. And the shipping information, you saw that it creates a sort of rectangle. But it could be empty, right? You don't always ship items, so you don't always ship your invoices. In fact, I've never shipped an invoice, at least I don't believe I have, but I have issued many of them. So the shipping address may not be used, and if it's not being used, we don't want to go through this, because if we go into it, you'll see that we create a rectangle. In fact, the first thing we do is draw a rectangle. So that's the container for the shipping information. And if we had no shipping information, we could just go through it. If this was null, it would fall. It would throw rather the exception. Okay, but it wouldn't be insert. It wouldn't insert anything. It would just have a rectangle laying around, which is not nice. It's not pretty. It's pointless. It shouldn't be there. So that's why we have that little if statement. Now, other than that, we draw the container with a rectangle. You'll see another container drawn with lines instead of rectangle, kind of a pointless thing, but I wanted to show you the difference. So this is the rectangle, this is one line, and this is how you achieve a rectangle. You have the X pen, that's the color, basically just the color, and the weight of those borders. That's it. And then you have the placement of it. Just like we have with the text, we have left, margin from the left, margin from the top, and then we have the size, the width, and the height. That's all we have. So these, you can separate them like that. This is the placement of the container, and this is the size of the container. That's it. That's all that there is to it. And then inside there we draw another string and then another string above it to say ship to. And then obviously inside will be the shipping address. Now I'm not handling the new lines, which I should be doing probably, and maybe I'll show you how to do that, but it gets complicated really fast with these arrangements. It's just insane how complicated it can get, and so every little corner you can cut, you should just take the opportunity to do it, because again, it will waste your time, and sometimes these don't really work all that well. For most most part, the basic stuff is great, but if you go into some more advanced arrangements, you can get some of these weird errors and exceptions, and those will be troublesome to handle, to say the least. Now then, we have the add shipping information. Let's go back to our main point of reference, and now we can take a look at the business information. Okay, adding the business information, we will look at these basic things, and then we'll take a look at the pages, probably the most exciting thing in here. Let's go to the business information. This is kind of a bit more complex. Okay, let's expand that. And you see, I have company from, and I have a rectangle. Now, can you guess where the rectangle is? Can you guess? It's probably quite obvious, right? I have top to bottom lines and left to right lines. So this is my rectangle. And if you remember, the previous one was just one line of code. This, if you draw lines, you have 4 lines of code, and it's incredibly difficult to get it right. You need to make calculations. You need to maybe even guess some of these numbers to fit them right and into the right places. So it is quite difficult. I wouldn't advise using this method. I just want to hopefully show the differences, if you can actually see the difference. But you can get the source code on Patreon, and if you compare the source code directly on your computer, you should be able to see the difference. Now, having said all that, if you do draw lines, you will have more place to sort of customize things, right? You can maybe do the lines that are left to right longer than the whole width of the container, so do kind of a fancy sort of arrangement or something like that. Maybe you want to bend it a little, right? Or do something exciting with it if you're a bit more of a designer than I am. So in any case, we have this whole thing, and once again we just have 2 points for the lines, and that's the first point, left to right. Okay, this is the first point, so that's margin left to right, and that is margin from the left, and that is margin from the top. And this is the second point, exactly the same thing, so it goes from one point to the other. That is how lines work in mathematics, right? You know all about the lines. It's not too difficult. And then after that, we have all the company data. All the company data. Now, you see, we do have quite a bit of code, and it doesn't look too difficult, but getting the placement right is actually quite tricky. So the less you have to do, the less data you have to show, the better. The quicker you will be able to be done with it and to get to the next thing, which is hopefully the release of the project, the publishing it on iOS, or maybe you're using Azure or something else. So we have all this stuff, and again, we just set the font, and we have, in this case, I'll show you, we use X Solid Brush. This is how you set the custom color. So you can see right here, it's from ARBG. Just a random color. Now, if you need the colors, you just go to Google and Google color picker, just write ARBG color picker, and you'll get many of them. So it's not that difficult to do. You shouldn't be guessing the colors, even if you know, even if you're very much experienced with it and you think you know these colors, just go and find the picker. It will be a lot quicker like that. So after that, the X point, and that's it. Basically, it goes for everything like that. And then we have the company too. So this one is a bit further, as you can see. Again, something that's quite difficult to get right. You need to match the top margin, but you need to move the left margin, and you need to sort of keep the top margins in place, and then move that around. A very difficult procedure indeed, but it does work in the end. And once again, this is just a copy. Basically, the difference here, if I can show you properly, see, we have in the first one we have 50. Okay, the starting point is 50 from the left. That is the company from. And then if we go to company 2, it's 350. Therefore, we have moved 300 points from the starting position. Okay, 300 points. Further is the new starting position for that second container. And that one hasn't changed. We don't want that to change, so that hasn't changed. Now, you know sort of how this whole thing gets generated to the extent of general data, the totals, right? But we still need to add the items. So now we will look at adding the items. At this point, you have seen what we do to generate the general information, the shipping address, and the business information. So all that stuff is ready and is in the page. Now what we are left with is the items, okay? The items, the final thing, but that comes into two stages, given that there are enough items. First of all, we have add first page table. The items are in a table and we will be adding them into tables. But if we have more than 5 items, and we check for that right here, we will move that into the next page, because obviously it will never fit into one page. All the items, if you have 50 of them, they will never fit in one page. We need to move into the next page, and this is what we do. If we have 5 or less, we don't even bother, because the first page can take all 5, and then we just do the first page. If we have more, okay, if we have more, we sort of finish with that first page, and then we move with adding other pages. Maybe 1, maybe 2, maybe 50. Who knows? And it doesn't matter. It will add all of them. But of course we start with the add first page table method. And once again, I just want to note, we do take GFX, X graphics right here. We do not take a reference to page directly. You need to take the reference to the X graphics. So let's jump into this and let's see what's happening. The first thing you have to do, or I had to do, or we have to do, is set the count, or the N. Okay, so this is how many items there will be in this first page. Now you may be thinking, we have total of 5, maximum of 5, so why do we need so many? Well, the reason is because we are building a table, we are establishing a table, okay? And it will require drawing some lines in some ways where you have to know the exact scope of the table, meaning the exact number of records in that table. And so, if the count of items, invoice items, is more than 5, meaning that it will jump into second and maybe more pages, then we just set the count, okay? Or rather, we just set the 5. But on the other hand, if it's less than 5, then we set the count for the items, meaning it's a different number. It might be 1 item, it might be 2 or 3 or 4 items, or 5 items, but it's not more than 5. If it's more than 5, we just stick to the 5 and that's it, because that's the maximum we can go to. Okay then, let's start with the first part of it. You can see right here I have a rectangle, I have a few lines, and I have a few strings. What is this? This is the head of the table, right? The first sort of row where we name all the columns. You may notice we don't have the description, because if you've seen the previous part of this video, and you should have seen it, it's very important to see it, the description goes into a sort of next row, kind of a bottom. I do that because description would obviously contain more text than the title, for example, or the price. At least in theory and in general, that's the idea of the description, right? It should be larger than the title. So we leave more space for that. Basically, the whole width of the table we leave for the description, therefore we don't name it anywhere in here. But we do have to establish a rectangle for that. And the rectangle, as you can see, it just has all those dimensions. Again, there's nothing too much to explain in terms of the dimensions. What you have to do when creating these things, you have to find your reference points. sort of initial reference points, and then do some trial and error, and then do some calculations along the way. Now, obviously, you could create some kind of a perfect plan, but if you're not experienced with this PDF Sharp library, it will be extremely difficult to actually do that, and it will be time consuming either way, and chances are you'll miss one of these numbers, you'll write in a wrong one, you'll make a mistake, and then you'll still have to go through that trial and error process. So planning is indeed required, but not too much of it, I would say. So what we have here, we have, if you remember, this is left, margin from the left, margin from the top. This is the X rect. It actually says, you see, it's X and Y. So, or you could say the starting position, I guess, X starting position and Y starting position of that rectangle in this arrangement. And then we have the width and the height. As you can see, the height is 25, so this will basically cover those names for things, right? The title, the price, and these different arrangements. Now, these lines are separating. They are separating all these names. So these lines are vertical. These are vertical lines that we are drawing. And that's it. That's all we need for the names. Now, the names, the beginning of that table, that's the easy part. It's not too easy per se, but it is the easy part of this arrangement, because the next part is indeed difficult. Now, we need, first of all, to set a starting point for the first two lines. The first two lines. Each record will have one line. The first line, okay, the line 1 right here, that is the starting point from the top, margin from the top, the Y, okay. The first one ends with the price, the discount, the title, with that row that you've seen, okay. And the next one will end with the description, and it will go and go and go and go, and it will be increased and increased and increased. And all that happens in the for loop. It all happens in a for loop. Let's open that up. And as you can see, the for loop, the limit of that loop is the n. The n, if you remember, that is the maximum amount of rows in that particular table, in this particular first page. So what we do here, we start drawing the lines. And some of them are thinner, some of them are thicker, the lines, all kinds of different arrangements we will have, but as you can see, all of them are lines. Now, there aren't that many of them, and there aren't that many strings in here, but it is very difficult to do. You just have to take your time and do it. There's no real cutting off the corners here. Obviously, you need to simplify it as much as possible, and that's what I try to do here, to get it up and running and released as soon as possible. Having said that, I am not going to lie to you. This is not an easy process, and you should expect to take some time with it. In fact, you'll probably take more time with this whole generating thing than you'll take time with setting up those databases and inserting the records and editing the records. So just to give you some real world comparing of things and how much time they take to make. So let's start with these two lines. As you can see, we have a thickness of a bit of a different perhaps thickness, and these, as you can see, let's go a bit to the left, to the right. You see, this is the line 1, line 2, line 2. So this first line will be the actual line 1, and this one will be the actual line 2. These are the actual lines. Now, on the next ones, I did something a bit different. I'm not taking the original lines. I could have done a reference point to that as well. Just as simply as I could have done with that. Doesn't really matter in this case, but basically, okay, if I just go to just a bit to the left like this, we have the draw of the line, and we have it increasing. On every cycle, it will be increasing. So this one starts from the left, 250, right? And then it's 521. The original size will be 521 because it will add 0. 60 by 0 will be 0. But on every cycle, it will be increased by 60. Okay, it will be multiplied and increased like that. So this takes some time to sort of work out and see if things are actually matching, but it does work out in the end. Now, this, as you can see, the x-coordinate is the same. Therefore, what that means is that the line is vertical, right? It goes from 521 to 550. Okay, and the next one will be 581. Okay, that will be well, not this one, but on the other cycle, in the next cycle, right? It will be 581, and then that will be 610. And it will go and go and go and go and go and go like that, just like that. And we have a few of them. So basically, these are matching those initial lines for the column names. That's what we are matching. In fact, if we take a look at the top, let's say we have 250 and 320. Okay, 250 and 320, and we do indeed have that right here. 250, 320, and then 420, and then 500. It all goes and it will match the previous arrangement. And actually, this is a kind of a reference point that you can check. You can see if everything is working correctly. You take a look at that. If they match, that's great. And if they don't match, obviously it won't align. So they do have to match. Now then, on to the next thing. We have, I guess we can take a look now at the drawing of the spring, because those are just the vertical lines. And then we draw the strings, which is great and good. But you may have noticed in the models, okay, in the data models for the item and for the invoice, I always had preset the empty string. There are no nulls in there. I do not use nulls. The reason for that is because if I put a null value in here, it will indeed throw an exception. And it will ruin the whole thing. Now, this is sort of done in a way where if one method fails, it will still generate somewhat of an invoice. Having said that, if it fails, say, on the title, it will mess the whole thing up, and it will actually be very difficult to debug, at least in terms of getting some users' feedback and debugging from that. Now, speaking about debugging, I will get to that. Actually, I'll get to that a bit later. But let's just finish with this. As you can see, it just loops through the items using the I from the for loop, and then it inserts it. And then it inserts it. Again, if you're not following this, you should definitely watch my video on how to use PDF Sharp in the first place, because it is rather difficult, and I actually show you how to make a table and how to sort of jump into the next page and to other pages and different pages, and just the basics of it. What does draw string do, how to set up the documents, how to set up or draw the lines, sort of the basic stuff, and how to set it up in general, because in Blazor and .NET 5 it won't work just by referencing the library. You do need to have a fancy arrangement. There is a way to make it work, and as you can see, I am making it work, but you do need to do something in order to make it work. Now then, we have a few perhaps more exciting arrangement. We have the quantity, Q&T, short for quantity in this case, and then we put it right here, but we put it below the price. Okay, we put it below the price. The price is for one item, right? Just like we insert in the table, and then the total right here in the bottom. The total will be calculated by multiplying the quantity by the price and adding a sales tax and subtracting the discount. But as you can see, we do both things just like we did in that setup thing in the table, in the Blazor, in the, well, mud Blazor, right, we used for that arrangement. We do calculate the price in money, and we have the price in percentage. And we do need to put it in one string. That's the best case scenario. You see, I draw one string and I simply add the percentage, the separator, and then also the total of that percentage, or rather the monetary value of that percentage value. I add it in one string. The reason for that is because the string, that one string, it will have one static starting point, but then it will be able to scale to the right to sort of fit properly. I won't have to sort of be worried that maybe the discount percentage will go beyond this percentage sign, it will go into that number. No, it will not happen. It will go sort of properly, just like you would have any other string. Obviously, it can go out of bounds, and this is kind of one of the flaws with this whole application. You have seen that happen with a shipping address that is not addressed, sort of going out of bounds things. But again, you want your basic product, you want something releasable, and so you have to avoid those sort of nitty-gritty kind of things. You just have to avoid it. There's no other way around it, otherwise you'll spend a lot of time and this will never get released. Okay, so on every cycle, on line 1, Y, we add plus 60. That's what we do, that's what we add. That's basically all that we really need to do. And it just draws and draws and draws. Okay, and then finally, once we end the loop, remember, we still don't have the borders on the left and the borders on the right. We don't have those two giant lines, and this is where we add the lines. Okay, this is where we basically add the lines. As you can see, it always starts at the same point. This is the line on the left, this is the line on the right, but then we multiply 60 by the n. The n is the total number of those rows that were added in this particular arrangement, in this particular case, and then we draw the line up to that point. And that's how we have the table for the first page. And that's it. Now, just before we go to the multiple pages, I want to address one thing about the task. Okay, async task. Now, I'm sure someone will see this and comment that you shouldn't have a task like that. You should return task completed or do something else and all that stuff. Having said that, the async is there for a reason. I will be adding some insights later on so I could actually follow and track some things and see if something breaks, some logging arrangements I will be adding. Therefore, I will be needing the async part. And that's why it's green. I know, I am aware of it, it's done on purpose. So with that said, now we can move into multiple pages. At this point, we are done with the first page region. Right here, we have the first page region and we are done with it. You saw how to add the first page table, how that is done. And so now we can jump into the add pages. So for more pages, 1 or 2 or 3 or however many you have or need, right? It will depend on the items. If we jump into that, just quickly go to definition as I usually do. Open that up. We have a PDF page and we have line 2 and all these different things. But let's start with, say, the loop. Okay, let's start with the loop, kind of going from a different place, but it will all come together. Because, as you can see, the loop starts from I5. It's not from 0. The reason for that is simply because we already have those previous items inserted in the first page. We already have that, we don't need it anymore. So we can move on to the next thing. And then we start from that particular index. And then our limit simply becomes the count. Okay, the count of the items is our limit. That's it. Now, initially we need a page. we need a page, we also need the X graphics. Because remember, we can't really reference the page all that properly. We need to sort of reference and recreate the X graphics rather than the page. It's just the way it goes, the way it works. So let's get into that. We have a page, right? And then we have a new page being added. Add page, that creates the reference for the page, and then we create the reference for the X graphics. We take that from the PDF page, this new page. But you see, it only happens in this if statement. Well, what does it mean, right? What does the if statement mean? It's either equal I equals to the 5, meaning that it will be the first cycle. Okay, so it's going to be either the first cycle, or it's going to be divided by 10, meaning every 10th item. So we have these two parameters, and that is when the page will go into the next page. Just as simple as that. And for that, we need to then add a new page, take the GFX, and then do all the stuff in the new page. That's all that there is to it. Now, it seems all simple and ready to go, but actually creating this, once again, it takes a lot of time. So you do need to get those corners in order to get this whole thing released. Okay? But the whole thing is, again, we have this if statement. Okay? This if statement basically starts up the new page. If it's not a new page, it simply adds the items. If it is a new page, it once again goes into the if statement and recreates that page. Creates a new page, has the reference, and now we are working with that new page. So now let's take a look at how it all comes together. In the if statement, after the new page is created and the reference is added for the X graphics, we can begin drawing, and everything, pretty much everything in this new page, in this if statement, will be meant for establishing the top part of the table. So the head of the table, the header of the table, whichever word you like to use. And that's all we have. Now we also have this vertical line for the whole table, just like you saw in the first page, in the first arrangement. So we have this these two draw lines, and then we start drawing the vertical lines. We start drawing, if we go to the left a bit, you'll see this one is the top one, and then we start drawing these vertical lines, and I kind of align them with the text. So we have a title, then we have our little vertical line that's separating the next thing, which is the price, and it goes on and on and on, similar way to what you saw previously. And once again, you can find the source code in Patreon, and you'll get a free course as well, maybe a few free courses depending on your tier. You'll be able to choose them, whichever one you want, for my courses on the Confucian Solution Learning platform. So the next thing, of course, is sales tax, and again, we just have everything to set up that table in that simple sort of a way. And another thing, you see we have line 1 Y and line 2 Y. So just like the first page table, we have the first line for all these different things that goes below all of these, right? And then the second line goes below the description. That's how it works. Now, these, you see, we set them right here. This is the sort of initial set. We didn't really need them, but it doesn't really hurt to add those numbers here, just so you have a bit of a reference. Again, some cleanup is required here, but it doesn't matter as long as it works. And so on every such cycle where you need to move into a different page, you need to reset the line 1, because obviously we need to start from the top of the page, and that is what this does. So now let's minimize this if statement, and let's get into the next part, right? And the next part is, of course, just that row of the table. So kind of a simple thing. Again, we'll need a few lines. And in this case, we just use this line 1y and line 2y. If you remember, for the first page table I did it in a sort of a different way, which doesn't really matter which one you do, but that one was 60 multiplied by I. In this case we don't multiply it by I, we just use the line 2 and line 1 y. Okay, and then on every cycle we just add it, and you saw that in the if statement. On a new page it will reset to that sort of default value, but other than that we just add 60 and add 60 and add 60. We have 10 items for each page and they fit quite well. Now other than that, you already saw this, and you saw this in the first page. Okay, we have all these vertical lines, the horizontal lines being drawn, and then we draw a few strings. We also make the calculations, right? We make the calculations, price, quantity, multiplied by discount, we get the discount, and do all these great things so that the user can see everything quite well. Let's see if I can get back to it. So that's basically it, right? We exit the loop and we return true. Again, you see no handling here, but I'll just add a few things to log the errors for now. I'm probably not gonna do a video on that. It's a very specific system of mine. I don't really want to show that, but you get the idea. You just log the errors somewhere in the exception, probably write a file somewhere, do something like that. Now, you see how this works. Hopefully you have a bit of an understanding, and of course you can download this code and learn more about it that way. Just go through it and see how it all actually comes together if you're just starting out with these PDF arrangements, or in general if you're just starting out with C# and you've never seen something sort of very complex, you know, you've just been doing maybe a few interfaces. I think this will be helpful to sort of get an idea on how you can do things in a more simple way, not what you see in these fancy books where you have who knows how much code for a very tiny little feature. So, you know, just to give you a bit of a perspective on what can actually be achieved if you just don't really care about every little detail and you just want to get something actually published, actually released. Now, with that said, we'll jump into the export. I'll explain this sort of fancy arrangement of the export. It's kind of an interesting thing, so let's just do that. I will now explain the two-step system that we have here for exporting the files. We of course start with the export method, and in it we simply have the exporting of that document. So remember, we have a first point of reference to the document object that has all the pages, all the data that you need for the PDF file, and then you can choose to either save it to a stream or you can choose to save it to a file, which is what I do in this arrangement. Now you might think it would be perhaps more straightforward to save it to a stream and then somehow download that, and it may be possible to do something like this, but I believe this is better and this is more efficient in terms of those server resources, or at least it might be the case. Now, mind you, we don't have a service to remove stale files, as I mentioned previously, but that will be added later, and we'll probably make a video on that. It can be quite interesting, those services. So we just have where it goes, where the file will go. We create a directory because that might be a problem if it's not created in the server. We would just check that it does indeed exist, and then we simply create a file that will be file, okay, the ID for the invoice .pdf. That's it. We just save the PDF file that gets created and it returns true. And if it fails, it returns false. I'll show you the interfaces a bit later, but now let's go and see how it gets downloaded. So in here, I have my invoices controller. I've added the invoices controller to the server-side Blazor project. That is indeed possible. Adding these controllers, it's not actually that difficult to do. And I think this might be useful if you have, say, server-side Blazor application, the web application, and you also want to develop a mobile app, say for Android, iOS, or something of that nature. So in that case, you can just add a controller. Now, let me just quickly explain how it's added. You can see right here we have controllers folder. You add your controllers like you would do in an API project. And if you want to learn more about API development, take a look at my API development course. Or if you want to learn Blazor and API development and SQL Server, take a look at my whole huge course. It's about 11 hours at the moment, and it's a slow-paced course where I type the code in and explain it. But you'll learn the Blazor, you'll learn API development, you will learn SQL Server in 2 different ways, Add-on-Net plus the Entity Framework access, and you also learn a bit about HTML plus CSS. So a very useful course. It is a slow-paced environment, so if you're into that, do check that out on my Confucian Solution Learning platform, and you'll get some other great deals. Or you can get the source code for this on Patreon, and you can pick that course to get it for free. Now, let's move on. We have the controllers, right? The controller folder. We still need to add a few things in the startup. If we go quickly to the startup, I'll explain this. A few things just to sort of set it up and have everything running. In the configure services, we need to add controllers. Okay? We need to add controllers because we are using them. Now also you may notice we have this add mud services. This is for the mud Blazor. In order to make the mud Blazor work, you need to add the services. So you also need to add services for the client-side Blazor as well, which is perhaps quite unusual, but you will need to do that. So check out my video about implementing the mud Blazor, setting it up, sort of basics of mud Blazor. It's a great video, and you'll learn all about it and how to set it up and where to put different things. But in any case, we add the controllers right here, and we will need to map the controllers right here, just like that. Endpoints, map controllers, and that's it. We have the controllers. Nothing too difficult here. You might just have to play around a bit with it, but it is indeed possible to add that, as you can see. And again, it might be quite useful if you're developing something else, an app, a mobile app, or something like that. Let's get back to the Invoices controller. We just have one route, download generated PDF. That's all that we need. You'll see that link displayed, right? You saw that with the date, the last generated date. And then we just have download file, file result, and we just open the read for the generated files for that particular ID in the same structure that we saved it in. It's going to be application/PDF, the content type, and it will download the file. That's it. That's all that there is to it. Now, you could add perhaps some token to make it a bit more secure or something like that. It all is possible, and it's all very, very useful. So, you see how we download it. Now, let's take a look at 2 different interfaces for the new invoice and for the list. For the new invoice page, the export is relatively straightforward because we only have one export on that one page. So one export per page, basically, right? And for that, we just use a couple of variables. We don't need to have anything too dynamic here. We have Boolean, export ready. Originally, it's of course false, right? And then date time, last export. Let's just go a bit to the top right here. This is where it will be displayed. You saw that link. So if the export is ready, true, right? Export ready, true. We display this mud link. It goes to a blank, a new tab, and we give it a link. The link, if you remember, that comes from the controller. That's it. We provide the ID, and it takes the ID and it downloads the file. And of course, we have last updated at last export. So this is how the display works, and let's see how it gets sort of generated. We also have this export error. We saw that it's displayed in a simply red colored paragraph, a red color for the text only. So if the text is empty, it's not displayed. If it's not empty, it is displayed. That's it. That's all that there is to it. And we use this export button, or method rather, on the button. we need to reset the error every time in case there was one, and you retry and it all works perfectly so that it wouldn't be sort of lurking around. And then we construct generate invoice PDF. We went through all that. It generates the invoice. And to generate the invoice, we simply run the generate method. You saw that as well. It checks all these things, inserts, checks if it's one page or more pages, and adds all the data, and then it returns. It actually does return a Boolean value, but I didn't bother with that. We don't really have any sort of proper way of checking it anyway. So we just have what we have, but we do have a try and catch statement, and it catches. We do have a breakpoint right here. So if it goes into the catch, into the exception, it will say unable to export. And if it's else on export Boolean, it will say once again unable to export. Unfortunately, but that's how it is, right? It may not be able to export. Hopefully it will be able to export, and hopefully it will run well. But once we have the export, we set export ready to true, therefore the link gets displayed, and we simply update the last export time, and we convert it to local time. That's all that there is to it in this new invoice. Now let's take a look at the invoices list. In the invoices list, the export is a lot more complex because we have more than one possible export in this page, right? So we have to have some kind of a list. In this case, we have a dictionary. And let's just zoom into this. We have this dictionary string, which is the invoice ID, and then date time, which is the last export for that particular ID. Now, if we go to the top, this is the table. Okay, the table. You saw this before. This is the mud button for the export. So once you click that, the export begins. The export method takes the ID. I'll show you that a bit later. But then we have this if statement, okay? If statement. So remember, in the row template, everything is different on each cycle. You get a new context, a new object for each cycle. And then on each cycle, we check if it contains that specific ID for that specific invoice. If the dictionary does not contain an ID, that means the invoice was never generated, right? It was never generated, therefore we do not display this link to the invoice to be downloaded, right? We do not display it. However, if it was indeed inserted, it will be in that dictionary and it will contain that key, therefore it will display the link, and then we will also just take from the exports, we will take the value, key value, right, dictionary, the value is the date time, last updated at. So kind of a relatively simple arrangement, but a bit tricky to arrange. But again, as you can see, the code is relatively clean. There's not much stuff going on into it. Now, if we get to the export, this will be a bit more complex because we actually need to retrieve the invoice from the database. We don't really have it. We have the list and we have a bit of data for the invoice itself, but we don't have the items when we don't really have some of the other stuff, right, that we need, say, for example, the companies. Therefore, we will establish the connection, we will open the connection, and we will use Invoice Data Manager, just like we would do for the editing. You saw the editing. We retrieve single invoice, and then for that single invoice, we retrieve all the items, all the available items for that invoice. And we reset the error export like that. Perhaps it should be done a little bit earlier, wouldn't hurt probably, but it doesn't matter, right? I'm not going to bother changing it now. I can do that later. So after that, we get to the PDF generator, construct that, take the invoice, and generate and export, just like you have seen previously in the new invoice page. Now, this is, of course, a bit different because we need to check if exports contain that key, if it's already been exported, right? If it's already been exported, it will be, the key will be in the list. It's just that the file has been updated, wherefore we just update the date. We just update the date and we move on. If not, if it's a newly generated PDF file, then we add the key, the ID, and then we add that current time. And that's it. That's all we have. And on else, if it's not able to export, we say unable to export. And if it fails with the exception, we say unable to export. Now, the error isn't really all that well displayed in here, but it really doesn't matter. That's not the point in this case. If you wanted to display this a bit better, obviously you would need to use a different object rather than dictionary, or you would use dictionary, but instead of just datetime you would use a custom model, and you have datetime, the error, and then you can display it like that. But all that can be done later. There's no need to bother with all of that, right? There's no need to bother because there are more important things to do, such as publishing this application. And also in this arrangement, since I missed the currency, I will also be adding the currency. So the next video will probably be adding the currency, or it might be the publishing. I'm not really sure, but the next video will be coming out very soon, whichever one it may be. So look forward to that, and also take a look at my courses. In the meantime, take a look at those videos about the PDF shop, about the mod Blazor, and of course check out my other videos. You can also take a look at some of my other Blazor examples, my free Blazor example course now on YouTube, 3 different examples, perhaps a bit smaller ones, but they are on client-side Blazor, so that's, I guess, somewhat interesting as well. And of course, if you want to get the source code, get it on Patreon. You'll get a free course, maybe a few free courses, depending on the tier. And with that said, we will conclude this video.